Dylan learned very early that gratitude was the safest disguise. It disarmed suspicion, softened judgment, and made people feel generous without realizing they were being measured. Around Will and Electra, Dylan perfected that mask, wearing appreciation like a second skin, speaking in careful tones about how much their kindness had changed her life, how she owed them more than she could ever repay. To anyone watching from the outside, she looked harmless, even fragile, someone shaped by circumstance rather than intent. Yet beneath that surface, something darker and far more focused was taking shape, an obsession that no longer hid itself even from Dylan. It centered on Will, on the ways concern came easily, on the quiet loyalty he extended without calculation. Gratitude, once a tool, became the language through which Dylan justified her growing fixation, convincing herself that closeness was not intrusion, but destiny slowly correcting itself. At first, the manipulation was subtle enough to feel like coincidence. Messages appeared on Will's phone from unknown numbers, brief and vaguely alarming, hinting at misunderstandings, at things Electra had supposedly said or done when he was not there. The words were chosen with care, never directly accusatory, always suggestive, designed to let doubt bloom on its own. Will tried to dismiss them as pranks or spam, but repetition gave them weight. Each message landed like a small crack in glass, barely visible on its own, but cumulative. When he asked Electra about them, his questions carried an edge he did not intend, a hesitation that made her feel suddenly observed rather than trusted. She sensed something shifting, though she could not yet name it. Dylan watched this distance grow with quiet satisfaction. She did not rush. Obsession, she believed, thrived on patience. She began arranging encounters with Will that appeared accidental, timing her presence to moments when he was already unsettled or vulnerable. A chance meeting after a long day, a conversation that drifted effortlessly into shared confidences, a sympathetic ear when he expressed confusion about Electra's recent mood. Dylan never criticized Electra outright. Instead, she spoke of concern, of worrying, of noticing changes that might indicate stress or secrecy. Each word was a thread, weaving a narrative that positioned Dylan as understanding and Electra as unknowable. As these encounters multiplied, Will found himself spending more time with Dylan without consciously deciding to. She presented herself as a stabilizing presence, someone who listened without judgment, who asked questions that felt supportive rather than invasive. He told himself it was harmless, even helpful, that he was simply being kind. Yet, slowly, the balance of his attention shifted. Moments that once belonged to Electra were now shared with Dylan, and the ease of those interactions began to feel dangerously comforting. The first incident involving Electra seemed minor, almost absurd in its ordinariness. A slip on a stairwell, a twisted ankle, nothing dramatic enough to raise alarms. Still, the inconvenience was real. Mobility became difficult, plans disrupted, independence temporarily stripped away. Dylan was there immediately, attentive and efficient, offering help before Electra could ask, stepping into spaces that had previously been private. Will, alarmed by Electra's injury, insisted on staying close, but the situation required coordination, assistance, someone to manage details Electra could not. Dylan filled that role seamlessly, positioning herself as indispensable without ever appearing to seek control. The irony was cruel. Electra's vulnerability drew Will closer in concern, yet it also bound him more tightly to Dylan's presence. Dylan framed herself as support for both of them, a bridge rather than a wedge. She spoke often of how lucky Electra was to have Will, how admirable his devotion was, reinforcing his sense of responsibility while subtly normalizing her own involvement. The more Will leaned on Dylan for logistical help, the more he justified her presence emotionally, until disentangling the two became difficult. Electra, confined and increasingly restless, began to notice patterns that unsettled her. Dylan's attentiveness felt excessive, her timing too precise. Conversations between Will and Dylan ended abruptly when Electra entered the room, their tones shifting in ways that suggested shared context Electra lacked. Messages arrived on Electra's phone as well, anonymous and unsettling, mirroring those Will had received but framed differently, implying Will's growing closeness to someone else. The effect was corrosive. Trust eroded not through confrontation, but through silence, each of them assuming the other was withholding something. Dylan fed this silence carefully. She never pushed too hard, never demanded exclusivity outright. Instead, she allowed misunderstanding to do the work. When Electra questioned her presence, Dylan responded with wounded humility, reminding Electra of her injury, of how much Will had needed help, of how grateful she herself felt to be useful. The implication was clear. Suspicion itself was unkind, unnecessary. Electra found herself apologizing even as her discomfort deepened, her instincts warning her that kindness was being weaponized against her. Will, meanwhile, began noticing inconsistencies that did not align with the narrative Dylan subtly promoted. Details in the anonymous messages did not quite match reality. Dates were off, contexts misrepresented. At first, he assumed confusion or coincidence, but doubt lingered. He started paying closer attention, tracing the timing of messages against Dylan's whereabouts, her sudden appearances against moments of tension between him and Electra. Patterns emerged reluctantly, as if resisting recognition. The realization that someone he had trusted might be orchestrating chaos felt absurd, almost insulting to his own judgment. Yet the evidence refused to disappear. The moment of clarity arrived not with a dramatic revelation, but with a quiet, devastating alignment of facts. Will discovered a fabricated screenshot, carelessly planted, but unmistakably false, a digital artifact meant to confirm suspicions that no longer felt organic. Tracing its origin led him, inexorably, back to Dylan. The betrayal cut deeper because it reframed everything that had come before. The gratitude, the concern, the patience he had admired, all of it collapsed into manipulation. Obsession, once hidden behind humility, revealed its teeth. Confronting Electra was harder than confronting Dylan. By the time Will spoke, the damage was already done. Words stumbled over accumulated hurt, explanations tangled with apologies. Electra listened with a mixture of relief and exhaustion, her own discoveries echoing his. They compared messages, timelines, moments that had once seemed inexplicable. The picture that emerged was devastating in its coherence. Dylan had not merely interfered, she had engineered distance with deliberate care, exploiting their strengths as well as their vulnerabilities. Facing Dylan together did not bring immediate resolution. She denied nothing and everything at once, framing her actions as misunderstood attempts to help, her obsession as concern, her manipulations as unfortunate coincidences. When pressed, her composure fractured, revealing flashes of resentment and entitlement that confirmed their fears. She spoke of sacrifice, of being overlooked, of believing she knew what was best for Will when Electra was distracted or unavailable. In her mind, love justified intrusion, and intrusion justified control. The aftermath left Will and Electra standing on unstable ground. Trust, once assumed, now required rebuilding through conscious effort. They grappled not only with Dylan's actions, but with their own responses, the ways silence and assumption had allowed doubt to flourish. Loving each other meant confronting the uncomfortable truth that devotion alone was not protection against manipulation. It required communication, vigilance, and the courage to believe in each other even when narratives pulled them apart. Dylan's removal from their lives did not erase the impact of her presence. The fractures she created lingered, demanding attention and care. Yet, in facing the threat together, Will and Electra rediscovered a shared resolve. Their relationship, tested to the brink, emerged altered but not destroyed. The ordeal forced them to see each other more clearly, stripped of illusion, aware now of how easily love could be exploited and how fiercely it could endure when defended with honesty. In the quiet that followed, the danger felt less immediate but no less instructive. Dylan had been a reminder that obsession rarely announces itself as such, that manipulation often arrives wrapped in gratitude and need. Will and Electra understood now that protecting their love meant more than guarding it from enemies outside. It meant recognizing how vulnerability could be turned inward, how trust could be bent if left unattended. Standing together, they faced an uncertain future with clearer eyes, determined not to let silence or fear define them again. Even as the shadow of what nearly tore them apart remained a warning they would never forget. The removal of Dylan from their immediate lives did not bring the relief Will and Electra had expected. Instead, it left behind a vacuum filled with echoes of manipulation, of silence, of moments that could no longer be trusted at face value. The apartment they shared felt altered, as if walls had absorbed too many half-truths to return to neutrality. Every familiar object seemed to ask a question neither of them could answer quickly. They had survived the fracture, but survival did not equal healing. Electra was the first to feel the weight of what had been taken from her. The injury to her ankle had healed enough for her to walk without assistance, yet the memory of dependence lingered like a bruise that would not fade. She replayed the weeks of immobility in her mind, recognizing now how carefully her vulnerability had been curated by someone else. Dylan had not needed to push hard, she had only needed to wait. Electra's anger did not burn outward, it turned inward, sharpening into self-reproach. She questioned her instincts, her intelligence, the confidence she had worked so hard to reclaim. The realization that kindness had been used as leverage against her felt more violating than the messages, more corrosive than the lies. Will carried a different burden? His guilt was active, restless, refusing to settle. He scrutinized his own behavior with merciless clarity, tracing the subtle ways he had allowed comfort to replace accountability. He had not intended betrayal, yet intention felt irrelevant now. He had listened when he should have questioned, accepted support when he should have insisted on transparency. Each choice, harmless in isolation, formed a chain he could not break without acknowledging his role in forging it. Love, he realized, was not weakened by scrutiny, it was endangered by complacency. They spoke often in those first days, sometimes with urgency, sometimes with exhaustion. Conversation stretched late into the night, circling the same questions from different angles. Why had they hesitated to confront the confusion sooner? Why had they each assumed the worst instead of turning toward each other? The answers were uncomfortable. Fear of conflict, fear of appearing insecure, fear of discovering something irreversible all had played their part. Naming those fears did not absolve them, but it allowed them to stand in the same truth at last. Dylan, meanwhile, did not vanish as cleanly as either of them had hoped. Her absence from their physical space only intensified her presence in memory. She sent no more messages, made no overt attempts at contact, yet the silence itself felt strategic. Will could not shake the sense that she was recalibrating rather than retreating. Obsession, he understood now, did not dissolve when confronted, it adapted. Electra sensed it too, a low-grade vigilance settling into her days, making her flinch at unexpected notifications, second-guess chance encounters. Trust, once broken, did not reassemble without effort. The first sign that Dylan was not finished arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly. A mutual acquaintance mentioned her in passing, describing a version of events that sounded unsettlingly familiar yet subtly altered. In that version, Dylan was the one who had been exploited, misunderstood, pushed aside after offering nothing but support. The narrative was polished, sympathetic, and dangerous. Electra felt a cold clarity settle over her. Dylan was no longer trying to divide them directly. She was repositioning herself as a victim, laying groundwork in a wider social circle where truth traveled slowly and perception hardened quickly. Will recognized the strategy immediately. Reputation, once destabilized, was difficult to repair. Dylan did not need to return to their lives to damage them. She only needed to control the story. The realization reignited his resolve, but it also forced a difficult choice. Pursuing the truth publicly risked reopening wounds and amplifying drama they both longed to escape. Remaining silent, however, would allow distortion to spread unchecked. Electra, already weary, struggled with the prospect of reliving everything under scrutiny. Yet she also understood that silence had been the soil in which manipulation had grown before. Together, they chose a different approach, measured, deliberate, and united. They began documenting everything: messages, timelines, inconsistencies, patterns of behavior that now appeared unmistakable in hindsight. It was not an act of revenge, but of preservation. If Dylan attempted to rewrite the past, they would be ready to counter it with clarity rather than emotion. The process was grueling. Revisiting each moment forced them to confront how close they had come to losing each other, how easily love could have been dismantled by suggestion alone. Yet it also reinforced the strength of their bond when anchored in truth. As weeks passed, the intensity of Dylan's shadow began to recede, replaced by a different challenge: rebuilding intimacy without fear. Electra struggled to relax into affection, wary of interpreting attention as intrusion. We'll learn to ask rather than assume, to invite dialogue where silence once sufficed. Their relationship slowed, becoming more intentional, less reactive. It was not the same love they had shared before. It was quieter, more deliberate, shaped by awareness rather than idealism. Then, unexpectedly, Dylan resurfaced not through confrontation, but through consequence. News reached them that she had attempted a similar pattern elsewhere, attaching herself to another circle, another pair of lives marked by transition and vulnerability. This time, however, the outcome was different. Someone noticed early. Someone questioned gratitude that felt heavy, attention that arrived too precisely. Dylan was confronted, exposed before obsession could fully take root. The pattern, once invisible, had become legible. The knowledge brought neither satisfaction nor relief. Instead, it left Will and Electra with a sobering understanding of how close they had come to becoming a cautionary tale rather than survivors. Dylan was not an anomaly. She was a reminder of how easily care could be mistaken for entitlement, of how obsession often dressed itself as devotion, of how love, when left unguarded by honesty, could be turned against itself. In the months that followed, life gradually resumed its rhythm. Not the same rhythm, but one steadier for having been recalibrated. Electra returned fully to her work, reclaiming independence without defensiveness. Will found balance between support and autonomy, learning that presence did not require proximity at all times. Together, they built something less fragile than before, rooted not in assumption but in communication. They did not forget Dylan, nor did they allow her to define them. The experience became part of their shared history, a chapter they referenced not with bitterness but with clarity. It taught them that love was not proven by endurance alone, but by the willingness to confront discomfort before it metastasized into distance. Standing side by side, aware of how easily they could have been undone, they chose each other again, not blindly, not desperately, but with open eyes and hard-earned trust. And in that choice, quiet and resolute, the power Dylan had once held over their lives finally dissolved not through confrontation or punishment, but through irrelevance.